November 13th, 1942. The tropical night over Guadalcanal was heavy with humidity, the kind that clings to skin and saturates clothing. Yet Captain Tamichihara felt no comfort, only a cold dread that ran along his spine. At Aero 148 hours, aboard the Japanese destroyer Amatsukaze, he gripped the bridge rail with a white-knuckled intensity. A searchlight beam cut through the darkness, slicing the night sky like a blade, and what he saw would haunt him forever. Around his ship, American shells erupted in clouds of fire and shrapnel, a violent symphony of metal and flame. They were not aiming. They were simply filling the sky with lead, overwhelming the senses, a storm of destruction that made the tropical night appear as bright as day. Tamichihara's personal log would later record his stunned observation. They are not aiming. They are simply filling the sky with metal. In those few words lay a truth that few Japanese officers fully grasped at the time. The war in the Pacific was no longer merely a test of tactics or courage. It was being decided by mathematics and industrial capacity, written in brass casings and cordite. In the next 35 seconds, the USS San Francisco would fire more 5-inch shells than some Japanese destroyers carried for an entire mission. The Americans weren't counting rounds. They were creating walls of fire, red-hot gun barrels glowing from continuous firing, their relentless rhythm a mechanical heartbeat of destruction. Thousands of miles away, in the calm harbor of Pearl Harbor, ammunition ships were already being loaded with the next shipment. 15,000 tons of shells, enough to replace everything the American fleet would expend in this single battle 50 times over. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Japanese naval planners debated whether they could spare 12 rounds per gun for the next convoy, the arithmetic of defeat quietly building with each passing day. Captain Tamichihara survived the night, later becoming the only Japanese destroyer commander to witness the war from Pearl Harbor to surrender, but his understanding of industrial warfare's lethal calculus began months earlier, during the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 7th, 1942. Commander Tishi Nato, executive officer of the carrier Shukaku, observed American cruisers and destroyers maintaining anti-aircraft fire for hours without pause. Each ship seemed to carry more anti-aircraft ammunition than an entire Japanese destroyer division, a reality that contradicted decades of Japanese naval doctrine. In Japan, anti-aircraft guns, like the Type 96 25mm light AA weapon, had strict firing protocols. Fire only at optimal range. Fire short bursts. Cease immediately when the target passed. These rules were not tactical choices. They were dictated by scarcity. Each ship's magazine could sustain just 12 minutes of continuous fire before exhausting its supply. The Americans, however, seemed impervious to such limits, their guns belching fire relentlessly, creating zones of lethal air, as if ammunition was infinite. Tamichihara, like many Japanese officers, was beginning to recognize a chilling pattern. This was not merely a disparity in skill or bravery. It was industrial warfare brought to its starkest form. One nation wielding inexhaustible firepower, the other counting each precious round, forced to ration courage along with shells. The seed of strategic collapse had been sown, though its full implications would only become painfully clear in the waters of Guadalcanal, later named by American sailors as Iron Bottom Sound. The night of November 13th would be remembered not just for its explosions, but for the revelation it brought. The Americans weren't precise. They were overwhelming. Captain Tamichihara watched in horrified fascination as the artificial daylight of American gunfire turned the sea into a theater of chaos. In this moment, the war's outcome was being written in steel and fire, a calculus that Japan had not prepared for, and that the world would come to understand as the grim arithmetic of industrial warfare. May 7th, 1942. The morning sun rose over the Coral Sea, painting the waves with streaks of gold, oblivious to the storm that was about to engulf it. Commander Tishi Nato, aboard the Japanese carrier Shukaku, peered through the periscope of his binoculars at the American fleet and felt a creeping unease. The Americans fired continuously, their cruisers and destroyers maintaining anti-aircraft volleys for hours without any sign of pause. It seemed impossible. How could they sustain this relentless output? Japanese doctrine, honed over decades, assumed that all navies were constrained by ammunition. Yet here was evidence to the contrary. The Type 96 25mm anti-aircraft guns aboard Japanese vessels followed strict rules. Fire only at aircraft within 800 meters, fire in short bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, then cease immediately. These rules were not tactical preferences, but necessities. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, stationed on the carrier Ryujo, had drilled his gunners tirelessly in these protocols. Each ship's magazine contained only enough ammunition for 12 minutes of sustained fire. After that, the ship would be defenseless. As Okumiya watched American destroyers, he realized with growing alarm that these foreign ships ignored all such limitations, firing continuously as if their magazines were bottomless. The Battle of the Java Sea on February 27th, 1942, had already hinted at the same troubling pattern. Captain Hara, commanding the destroyer Amatsukaze, witnessed a Japanese tactical triumph that was simultaneously a strategic warning. The combined Allied fleet, British, Dutch, American, and Australian, fired over 608-inch shells, scoring only 5 hits, 4 of which were duds. Japanese forces, firing far fewer rounds, achieved decisive blows. Yet what unsettled Hara was the Americans' relentless fire. They never stopped, never paused to conserve ammunition, their sheer volume making accuracy secondary. The Allied fleet was a torrent of shells, indifferent to loss, indifferent to economy. Hara's after-action report would later reflect a deep unease. The Americans seemed to have unlimited rounds. They fired as though ammunition was infinite. This was not simply a tactical curiosity. The Japanese Navy, for all its skill and discipline, was bound by scarcity. During the August 7th landings on Guadalcanal, Vice Admiral Gonichi Mikawa's striking force carried just enough ammunition for a single night engagement, not as a choice, but because that was all that existed in the depots at Rabaul. Even in moments of tactical success, this limitation dictated strategy. In the Battle of Tsavo Island on August 9th, Mikawa's ships sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers in just 33 minutes without losing a single vessel. Yet afterward, Commander Toshikazu Omi admitted that the withdrawal was dictated not by fear of counterattack, but by the exhaustion of their ammunition. The American transports, loaded with crucial supplies, remained untouched, a glaring testament to scarcity dictating strategy. Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, the reality of American industrial capacity stood in stark contrast. Captain William Poco Smith oversaw the loading of the USS Rioneer with 5,000 tons of naval ammunition, including hundreds of thousands of 5-inch, 40mm, and 20mm rounds. This single shipment surpassed what the Japanese Navy could hope to produce in months. Each American destroyer could discharge in minutes the quantity of shells that Japanese forces risked entire convoys to deliver. On November 30th, 1942, Rear Admiral Riso Tanaka led 8 destroyers to supply Guadalcanal. Their cargo included less than 300 drums of ammunition, barely enough to equip 15,000 soldiers for a short skirmish. A single American destroyer, firing for 20 minutes in practice, could expend more than Japan had painstakingly transported for weeks of desperate combat. Captain Hara's log reflected bitter resignation. We risk 8 destroyers, dozens of lives, tons of fuel to deliver what the Americans probably waste in target practice. The disparity was staggering. The Americans had turned quantity into a weapon, liberating their tactics from the limitations that bound the Japanese. The realization was beginning to settle in among Japanese officers. This war would not be decided solely on courage or skill, but on the calculus of supply, production, and industrial might. The mathematics of victory and defeat were being written in brass and cordite long before any battle was fought. August 1942, the waters around Guadalcanal simmered under the oppressive tropical sun. Japanese destroyers, nicknamed the Tokyo Express by Allied forces, raced along the narrow, reef-strewn channels of the Solomon Islands. These nightly missions were perilous, each vessel packed to the gunwales with supplies, ammunition, and soldiers. Every voyage was a gamble against American air reconnaissance and naval patrols. The Japanese Navy's logistical predicament was stark. The islands were isolated, and supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Each pound of ammunition was precious. There was no margin for waste. Commander Tishi Nato, now reassigned to coordinate the Tokyo Express runs, noted the irony bitterly. The same Americans who seemed to fire endlessly, ignoring the limitations of magazines and barrels, now targeted every single Japanese shipment with ruthless precision. For every ton of ammunition that reached Japanese troops, 2 were destroyed at sea, either by airstrikes or submarine attacks. Ships returned empty, burned, or sunk, carrying only the ghosts of cargo they were meant to deliver. On the night of August 17th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya piloted the destroyer Kagero through the darkened straits. His mission: deliver 150 drums of ammunition to the embattled garrison at Henderson Field. Enemy searchlights sliced through the night, illuminating waves like molten silver. Every turn of the helm could mean death. Japanese crews knew that if they were sunk, the soldiers on shore would face the morning with bullets, shells, and artillery that simply did not exist. The Tokyo Express was not merely a supply route, it was a lifeline under siege. Yet the tension between operational necessity and scarcity gnawed at every officer's mind. Rear Admiral Riso Tanaka, S. Staff, had calculated that each day's allotment of ammunition was barely sufficient for a single defensive engagement. A misstep, a delay, or a loss could render an entire island defenseless. By contrast, American forces could storm forward with reinforcements and shells arriving daily from stateside factories. The calculus of war was shifting, not through tactics alone, but through the relentless arithmetic of industrial capacity. At Henderson Field, the Japanese garrison depended on meticulous rationing. A single soldier might be allotted 10 rounds for his rifle per day, and artillery crews received shells only when absolutely necessary. This rationing dictated engagement, limited offensive options, and forced commanders to think in fractions of firepower. Yet, time and again, they faced the Americans, whose guns roared without restraint. Each salvo consumed thousands of rounds, a torrent of fire that would have been unsustainable for Japan's constrained logistics. The disparity was magnified during the Battle of Cape Esperance on October 11th, 1942. Japanese forces attempted a surprise night attack on an American task force, relying on stealth and precision. They inflicted serious damage, but withdrew because their ammunition was nearly exhausted. American cruisers, in contrast, fired with impunity. One American ship could expend the same number of shells that had taken a Japanese flotilla days to deliver via the Tokyo Express. The irony was cruel. Skill, surprise, and courage could achieve victories, but the war's momentum belonged to whoever could sustain firepower consistently. And for Japan, that meant constantly fighting against scarcity. Back in Rabaul, Rear Admiral Mikawa pondered the unyielding truth. His officers could win individual engagements, sink Allied cruisers, and disrupt supply lines, but they could not produce shells fast enough to match the Americans' inexhaustible arsenals. The war was no longer simply a duel of ships and tactics. It was a race of production. Factories in the United States belched out steel, cordite, and brass, flooding the Pacific with shells that could overwhelm the carefully rationed Japanese forces. Every night of the Tokyo Express reminded officers of the imbalance. No matter how daring the operation, each success came at a cost measured not in victories, but in depleted resources that could not be replenished. Commander Okumiya's log entry on that August night summed up the grim reality. We fight not only men and machines, but time and supply. Every shell we fire is borrowed. Every ton of ammunition delivered is a miracle. The strategic lesson was unavoidable. In the Pacific, courage alone could not win the war. Production, supply, and relentless output would determine the ultimate victor. Japanese officers learned this truth night after night, voyage after voyage, as the Tokyo Express threaded through darkness and danger, each successful delivery a fragile lifeline in a war dictated by scarcity. September 1942. Guadalcanal's jungles reeked of humidity, blood, and smoke. Japanese soldiers, exhausted from relentless night marches and supply shortages, held precarious positions around Henderson Field. Each unit knew that their stock of ammunition was limited, sometimes rationed to a few rounds per rifleman per day. Artillery crews fired sparingly, calculating each shell's potential impact with painstaking care. Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Sato, newly arrived from Rabaul, surveyed the battlefield from a ridge overlooking the airfield. The Americans had fortified positions with sandbags and machine gun nests, their fields of fire unrelenting. Yet Sato's mind was occupied not just with tactics, but with logistics. The last Tokyo Express had delivered only half the supplies expected, and the next shipment might be intercepted. Every maneuver, every attack, had to account for the fragile lifeline of shells, grenades, and mortar rounds. In the pre-dawn hours of September 12th, a small Japanese assault targeted an American machine gun nest near the Lunga perimeter. Soldiers crept through the mud-soaked jungle, rifles in hand, grenades strapped to belts. Sato's orders were precise: conserve ammunition, Fire only when necessary. Each soldier carried no more than 12 rounds for his rifle. The Americans, by contrast, had endless magazines, their gunners firing bursts without hesitation, confident in a continuous supply chain that Japan could not match. Private Kenji Morita, one of Sato's men, felt the pressure keenly. As he fired his last 3 rounds at a machine gun position, the recoil of his rifle was a cruel reminder that the next shots might not come. Around him, comrades dropped grenades with surgical precision, knowing that wastage could mean catastrophe. The assault achieved a temporary foothold, but the cost was painfully clear. Each soldier who survived carried not just wounds, but the weight of scarcity. The Japanese command structure had adapted in part through ingenuity. Rations of ammunition were rotated among units, depending on mission priority. Artillery fire was reserved for key objectives, and night raids became essential to reduce exposure to American firepower. But even the best laid plans could falter. During one night engagement near the Tenaru River, Japanese forces exhausted nearly all their available rifle rounds. Hand-to-hand combat erupted, desperate and brutal, because shells were no longer available. The jungle echoed with the clash of bayonets and the cries of the wounded. Meanwhile, the Americans advanced steadily. Their ability to deliver reinforcements and shells daily allowed them to absorb losses and maintain continuous pressure. Henderson Field's aircraft, armed with a steady stream of bombs and bullets, could strike Japanese positions with impunity. For Japanese troops, the disparity was unmistakable. Skill and courage could delay the inevitable, but the relentless arithmetic of supply dictated the tempo of war. Rear Admiral Mikawa, watching reports from Rabaul, understood the cruel reality. Japan's audacious night attacks and bold maneuvers could not compensate for what the Americans could produce in a single day. Each Tokyo Express run was a gamble. Each loss at sea translated into exhausted garrisons on Guadalcanal, forced into defensive actions with only fractions of the ammunition needed. By late September, Sato's battalion faced a grim situation. Artillery shells were nearly depleted, rifles fired their last rounds, and soldiers scavenged bullets from fallen comrades. Yet morale, while strained, remained intact, driven by camaraderie and the belief that one more night of effort might tip the balance. But the cruel arithmetic of supply remained immutable. Every shell lost at sea, every ton of rice or ammo delayed, was another inch ceded to the Americans. The Guadalcanal campaign became a harsh lesson in war's logistics. Japanese troops fought with valor and ingenuity, but in a war where firepower could not be replaced fast enough, courage alone was insufficient. The battlefield was no longer simply a contest of men and strategy. It was a calculation of production, shipment, and survival. As Sato wrote in his journal that night, "We hold the line with what we have, not what we need. Every engagement is borrowed strength, every victory a debt we may never repay." October 1942. The humid air hung heavy over Guadalcanal, carrying the metallic scent of battle and the stench of decomposing jungle. Japanese forces, stretched thin and increasingly desperate, faced an unrelenting American advance. Henderson Field remained under constant threat, and every day brought fresh reports of casualties and dwindling supplies. Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Sato surveyed his men as they prepared for another assault. Artillery fire was minimal. Shells were nearly gone, rationed only for the most critical strikes. Small arms ammunition was carefully counted. Soldiers were told to fire only when targets were clearly within reach. Every patrol, every attack, had to consider the delicate balance between action and survival. During the battle for Edson's Ridge, Japanese troops launched a ferocious night assault on the American positions. The assault relied on surprise, stealth, and the ferocity of hand-to-hand combat. With rifles mostly empty, soldiers resorted to bayonets, grenades, and whatever improvised weapons they could carry. Despite bravery and determination, the Americans' defensive positions, supported by continuous reinforcements and ample ammunition, held firm. Private Kenji Morita, bloodied and exhausted, reflected the grim reality. "We fight with what we have, not what we need," he whispered to a fellow soldier. The phrase had become a bitter mantra among the men. Ammunition scarcity forced improvisation, but ingenuity could only go so far against a well-supplied enemy. Meanwhile, American forces maintained relentless pressure. Machine gun nests crisscrossed the jungle, providing overlapping fields of fire. Artillery and aerial bombardments softened Japanese positions before ground assaults. Each American soldier could fire hundreds of rounds per day, confident in a supply chain that Japan could not match. The contrast was stark. Courage and skill could delay defeat, but they could not reverse the arithmetic of supply. The Japanese High Command attempted bold maneuvers to change the tide. The Tokyo Express ran nightly missions, delivering troops and meager supplies under the cover of darkness. Yet each run was perilous. American naval patrols intercepted shipments, sinking transport and supply ships. Every loss at sea directly translated into exhausted garrisons on Guadalcanal, unable to sustain prolonged offensives. By mid-October, Japanese forces faced a harsh reckoning. Henderson Field remained operational, American forces controlled key terrain, and Japanese troops were depleted. Sato's battalion had fought with valor, but attrition and logistical strain had taken their toll. Ammunition was gone, rations were scarce, and disease and exhaustion further weakened the soldiers. In his journal, Sato wrote, "We fight not against men, but against time and supply. Each day we cling to the jungle, knowing that the next may be our last. Courage cannot replace what we lack." The Guadalcanal campaign had evolved into a brutal test of endurance and logistics. Japanese strategy, no matter how audacious, was undermined by the relentless arithmetic of supply. The Americans, bolstered by a robust production and delivery network, could sustain continuous pressure that Japan simply could not match. The campaign was a stark illustration that in modern warfare, resources, ammunition, food, and reinforcements could determine outcomes as decisively as tactics or valor. As October waned, Japanese commanders acknowledged the painful truth. Without adequate supply lines, even the bravest soldiers could not hold the line forever. The jungle, once a potential shield, became a graveyard for courage and ambition, where the limits of logistics dictated the fate of men and the course of war. November 1942. The Japanese withdrawal from Guadalcanal marked a bitter turning point. Troops boarded the last remaining destroyers under cover of night, leaving behind exhausted comrades, shattered equipment, and the mangled remnants of what had once been ambitious offensives. The Japanese High Command had recognized, too late, that courage and tactical skill could not compensate for the yawning gap in supplies and ammunition. Captain Tamichihara, now returned to base, reviewed the reports with a hollow sense of inevitability. Every calculation, every assessment confirmed a painful truth. The Americans' industrial machine, vast, disciplined, and tireless, had determined the battle long before the first shot was fired. Guadalcanal was not a loss of strategy alone. It was a lesson in arithmetic, played out in fire and blood. The statistics were staggering. While Japanese forces struggled with a few hundred rounds per gun, American batteries had maintained near constant fire for days. Ammunition shipments arrived as needed, gunners trained with thousands of rounds, developing muscle memory and confidence that translated into devastating combat effectiveness. In contrast, Japanese soldiers often fired only when necessary, each shell precious and calculated, each missed opportunity a haunting echo of scarcity. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya reflected on the paradox. His men had trained for precision, efficiency, and discipline, yet these virtues became liabilities against an enemy unconstrained by limitations. The Americans treated shells as tools of suppression, intimidation, and territorial control. Japanese doctrine, honed over decades, emphasized conservation, often sacrificing opportunity in the name of economy. The arithmetic of abundance versus scarcity was never more apparent than in the bloody jungles of Guadalcanal. The Tokyo Express, once hailed as a clever solution to supply constraints, revealed its limitations. Destroyers race through American-controlled waters, delivering minimal ammunition, a few crates of rifles, or rations. Each loss, whether from submarine attack, air raid, or navigational mishap, directly translated into weakened positions and compromised morale. Entire battalions, trained for offensive action, found themselves paralyzed by lack of munitions. At the strategic level, Japanese planners faced impossible choices. Should they commit forces with minimal ammunition, hoping for tactical brilliance to offset scarcity, or conserve resources, allowing American forces to fortify positions and consolidate gains? Every decision reflected the harsh calculus imposed by limited production capacity, whereas the Americans calculated firepower and logistics as a seamless continuum. The Japanese were forced to ration, prioritize, and gamble, often with lives as the currency. The human cost was equally stark. Soldiers like Private Kenji Morita and Lieutenant Sato endured weeks of near starvation, with ammunition so scarce that training exercises became impossibilities. Casualties mounted, not just from combat, but from disease, exhaustion, and the psychological toll of helplessness. Yet, amidst the despair, the Japanese soldiers displayed remarkable discipline and courage, exemplifying the paradox of fighting valiantly within an arithmetic trap they could neither escape nor alter. For the Americans, Guadalcanal was a testament to industrial advantage as much as battlefield skill. Every gunner, every platoon, every supply ship reflected a national system capable of sustaining attritional warfare indefinitely. Ammunition depots in the continental United States, loaded with millions of rounds and replenished continuously, ensured that even the most prolonged engagements could be met with overwhelming firepower. The campaign demonstrated that logistics had become a decisive weapon, eclipsing the heroics of individual combatants. As the last Japanese ships slipped away, American forces reclaimed positions with minimal resistance. The jungle, soaked in sweat, blood, and gunpowder became a silent witness to the interplay of courage, scarcity, and industrial capacity. Guadalcanal had shown that victory was not solely a matter of strategy or valor, it was a function of production, distribution, and the capacity to deliver destruction at scale. In the subsequent months, Japanese planners revisited their assumptions. Battles could be won tactically, but lost strategically if the arithmetic of supply was ignored. Guadalcanal stood as both a cautionary tale and a turning point. The Pacific War was no longer just a contest of ships, planes, and men. It was a contest of industrial civilization against ambition constrained by scarcity. Early 1943, the lessons of Guadalcanal reverberated across the Pacific. Japanese forces, still reeling from the loss, struggled to reorganize, patch supply lines, and maintain morale. The Americans, emboldened by their industrial might, pressed the advantage, initiating campaigns across the Solomon Islands with a confidence born not just of victory, but of inexhaustible resources. Rear Admiral William Halsey emphasized a simple but decisive principle. In this war, supply is strategy. Each amphibious landing, each artillery barrage, each fighter sortie depended not solely on skill, but on an uninterrupted stream of material. Guadalcanal had proven that even the most tenacious soldiers could be ground down if their munitions ran out. The Japanese, in contrast, faced a harrowing arithmetic. Their shipyards and factories, though capable of extraordinary engineering feats, could not match the production scale of the United States. Every battleship, every aircraft, every shell was precious. Every loss echoed throughout the theater of war. Commanders increasingly resorted to creative, even desperate measures. Night runs of destroyers, stockpiling on tiny islands, and, eventually, plans that would culminate in kamikaze tactics, sacrificing pilots to offset the numerical superiority of the enemy. On the battlefields of New Georgia and Bougainville, the arithmetic of logistics became evident. American forces, able to rotate troops, maintain heavy artillery, and launch coordinated airstrikes, dominated supply-limited Japanese positions. Even when terrain favored ambushes or infiltration, Japanese units found themselves outgunned. Patrols that might have succeeded under equal resourcing were neutralized by sheer volume of American fire. Lieutenant Colonel Takeda, leading a contingent of Japanese soldiers in the dense jungles of Bougainville, wrote in his journal, "Courage alone cannot fill the magazines that our guns demand. We fight, yes, but the enemy's strength lies not just in men, but in the endless tide of shells, planes, and ships they can call forth. We are trapped between our honor and arithmetic we cannot overcome." This arithmetic of war, the balance of production and supply, reshaped strategy. The Japanese sought to exploit mobility and surprise, but even their most brilliant maneuvers were constrained by scarcity. A battalion could not hold a position if ammunition and rations dwindled. A squadron could not contest the skies if fuel reserves were insufficient. Every decision became a calculation of risk versus resource, often with catastrophic consequences. The Americans, meanwhile, innovated relentlessly. Landing craft, portable artillery, and integrated logistics systems allowed them to project power across hundreds of miles of ocean. Engineers prefabricated airstrips, medical stations, and supply depots, turning remote islands into fully operational bases within weeks. Firepower and sustainment became inseparable, and Guadalcanal had proven that superior numbers alone were irrelevant without a supporting infrastructure. As the campaign stretched from the Solomons to New Guinea and the Gilberts, the disparity widened. Japanese soldiers, resilient and disciplined, faced a relentless adversary whose strength lay not only in strategy or courage, but in the arithmetic of industrial capacity. Each confrontation became a study in inevitability. Even when tactical skill allowed for temporary gains, the overarching flow of men, munitions, and machinery dictated the outcome. By mid 1943, the tide had shifted irreversibly. The Japanese High Command began to acknowledge, if only reluctantly, that their empire's expansion had outrun its logistical capacity. Even brilliant tactics and heroic resistance could not compensate for shortages that now affected every level, from small unit skirmishes to naval engagements. The war, increasingly, was being decided not on courage alone, but on the ability to sustain that courage with endless streams of metal, fuel, and ammunition. By late 1943, the arithmetic of war had begun to dictate Japanese strategy in increasingly extreme ways. The inability to match American industrial output forced a grim calculus. If they could not win through attrition, perhaps they could impose a cost so heavy that it would force the United States to reconsider its advance. The concept of the kamikaze, divine wind, emerged not out of ideology alone, but out of necessity. Pilots volunteered, sometimes under subtle coercion, knowing that each mission was a one-way journey. The goal was clear: to inflict maximum damage with minimal resources, turning human sacrifice into a force multiplier against a materially superior enemy. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the early kamikaze units, wrote in his secret memorandum, "We cannot match them in steel and firepower, but we can harness the resolve of our people to create a weapon that industrial production cannot replicate, the will to give one life to strike a decisive blow. This is our arithmetic." The strategy reflected a shift from conventional logic to moral and psychological calculus. American ships, once confident in their armor and numbers, now faced an enemy willing to circumvent conventional cost-benefit equations entirely. Each kamikaze attack could sink a destroyer or cripple an aircraft carrier, achieving disproportionate results with minimal material expense. On the ground, Japanese troops mirrored this desperation. Soldiers, running low on food, ammunition, and medical supplies, relied on ingenuity and improvisation. Jungle tunnels became fortified command posts. Booby traps slowed American advances. Even local resources were turned into weapons. Yet these acts of ingenuity could not reverse the broader trend. The flow of American men and materiel was relentless, rendering isolated tactical victories strategically insignificant. Meanwhile, American commanders adapted. Aircraft carriers and anti-aircraft guns became mobile fortresses, and radar technology allowed fleets to detect kamikaze planes before they reached striking distance. Supply chains became more sophisticated, ensuring that each front had the ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements necessary to absorb and repel these desperate attacks. In the skies over the Philippines and the Central Pacific, the grim arithmetic became vividly apparent. For every kamikaze pilot lost, dozens of American planes and crews survived, their production lines replacing the lost assets almost immediately. The psychological shock of the attacks, intended to terrify and demoralize, gradually gave way to disciplined countermeasures, turning sacrifice into strategic inefficiency. By mid 1944, the kamikaze tactic had become a symbol of both bravery and futility. Japan's elite pilots and soldiers fought with extraordinary courage, yet the relentless logic of supply and production dictated the course of the war. Courage alone could not overcome fuel shortages, outnumbered forces, or industrial imbalance. The war was increasingly a contest of arithmetic, of factories, convoys, and the speed at which resources could be delivered to the front lines. In essence, the Pacific War had transformed into a numbers game of unparalleled scale. Each side calculated losses and gains, but only one had the capacity to sustain them indefinitely. The Japanese strategy, though ingenious and terrifying, was ultimately constrained by limits their bravery could not erase. And as 1944 drew to a close, it became clear that the only way for Japan to alter the trajectory was to achieve a decisive blow, an elusive goal in a conflict defined more by production lines than by individual heroism. By 1944, the United States had perfected a strategy that leveraged its unparalleled industrial might, the island hopping campaign. Every operation was meticulously planned, not just in terms of tactical objectives, but also in terms of supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements. Each seized island became a staging ground, a forward base where ships, aircraft, and soldiers could refuel, rearm, and repair. The logistics train, massive, complex, and relentless, was as decisive as any battle plan. Japanese commanders, constrained by dwindling resources, watched in horror as the Americans advanced with staggering efficiency. Each lost island not only denied strategic positions, but also illustrated the stark disparity in production. While Japanese garrisons clung to beaches with dwindling ammunition and food, American forces arrived with enough artillery shells to sustain weeks of bombardment, enough fuel to maintain air superiority, and enough medical supplies to treat casualties without ever pausing the advance. The capture of Saipan in June 1944 demonstrated this stark reality. The Japanese defenders fought with fanatical resolve, yet their artillery, meticulously conserved, could not match the sheer volume of American fire. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashed barrages that transformed the terrain into a furnace of metal and fire, each shell a testament to the industrial power fueling the offensive. Japanese calculations, how many rounds they could afford, how long each battery could hold out, were rendered meaningless in the face of this torrent. Across the Pacific, the Americans orchestrated amphibious assaults with a precision previously unimaginable. Troops landed under the cover of air and naval bombardments, each coordinated strike supported by a network of supply ships carrying thousands of tons of ammunition. The psychological impact on Japanese soldiers was profound. Many witnessed entire coastal defenses obliterated before they could even fire a shot. The arithmetic of war, endless shells, constant reinforcement, eroded morale as effectively as any defeat in combat. The Japanese response was increasingly desperate and innovative. In the Mariana Islands and later in the Philippines, kamikaze pilots were deployed in waves, hoping to disrupt supply lines and sink American vessels. Yet even these suicidal missions could not offset the overwhelming material advantage. For every aircraft destroyed, dozens more replaced it within days. Each kamikaze attack, intended to multiply the effectiveness of scarce resources, ultimately highlighted the strategic impotence of bravery when unaccompanied by supply. Meanwhile, the home front reflected the growing crisis. Factories, arsenals, and workers strained to keep pace, producing ever fewer shells, guns, and planes. Materials such as copper, steel, and lead were increasingly scarce. Temple bells, bronze statues, and household items were melted down to supply munitions. Yet even these extraordinary measures could not bridge the gap, whereas the Americans expanded new depots like Hastings, employing tens of thousands of workers and churning out hundreds of thousands of rounds monthly. Japanese facilities operated at fractions of this scale, often relying on conscripted children under dangerous conditions. The contrast was stark. On one side, fleets moved as if the only limit was imagination. On the other, every shell fired, every plane launched, required painstaking calculation. The arithmetic of industrial production now dominated every battlefield decision. The Allies' operational tempo was sustained, relentless, and unbroken. Japanese commanders, despite tactical genius and personal courage, faced a reality that no strategy, no ingenuity could fully overcome. By late 1944, the psychological dimension of this industrial imbalance became undeniable. Japanese sailors and soldiers internalized the lesson that courage alone was insufficient. Each engagement reinforced the painful truth. American victory was not contingent upon individual skill or bravery, but on an inexhaustible pipeline of men, materials, and munitions. The war was being won long before battles were fought in factories, shipyards, and supply depots that transformed national wealth into sustained combat power. This reality would soon culminate in the climactic confrontations of 1945, where Japan's remaining forces, constrained by dwindling supplies and overwhelmed by industrial disparity, faced the inexorable march of American firepower toward their home islands. The arithmetic of production, logistics, and replenishment was now the ultimate arbiter of life and death, turning the Pacific Ocean into a theater of both human courage and industrial supremacy. By early 1945, the focus of the Pacific conflict had shifted from contested islands to the very heart of Japan itself. American air power, perfected over years of industrial scale preparation, now dominated the skies. Strategic bombers, escorted by swarms of fighters, could strike targets hundreds of miles inland, delivering not just munitions, but a psychological message. Nowhere was safe, and production itself was now a battlefield. The B-29 Superfortress became the centerpiece of this campaign. Long range, high altitude, and heavily armed, it symbolized the intersection of technology and industrial output. Each aircraft was a product of thousands of labor hours, advanced engineering, and supply chains stretching across continents. Its payload, tons of bombs capable of leveling entire neighborhoods, was supported by an equally vast logistical network, from fuel depots in the Mariana Islands to spare engines and parts carried aboard auxiliary ships. Japan's cities, densely packed and largely constructed of wood, were vulnerable to incendiary bombs. By March 1945, precision bombing had given way to area bombing, designed to destroy entire urban centers and, critically, to disrupt industrial production and worker morale. Firestorms consumed Tokyo in a single night, killing tens of thousands and leaving 500,000 homeless. Factories, Warehouses and workshops were reduced to rubble. The arithmetic of industrial imbalance was now measured in human suffering. Each destroyed city represented both a tactical victory and a further widening of the production gap between the two nations. Japanese defenses were heroic, but ultimately insufficient. Anti-aircraft guns peppered the skies, and fighter pilots mounted desperate intercepts. But the sheer volume of American sorties overwhelmed them. Radar systems detected incoming formations, yet few countermeasures could match the continuous stream of bombers. Even kamikaze aircraft, previously deployed in the Philippines and Okinawa, could do little to halt the aerial assault over the home islands. The numbers were simply too great. The logistical backbone of the United States enabled this sustained bombing campaign. Replacement crews, maintenance teams, and bombers rotated in an unbroken cycle. Airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam functioned as forward bases capable of supporting thousands of missions. Each sortie demanded meticulous planning, fuel calculations, bomb loads, flight paths, timing of fighter escorts. The arithmetic of logistics governed the sky as surely as gravity governed flight. Meanwhile, Japan struggled to maintain production under relentless attack. Factories were dispersed, often hidden in mountainous regions. But even these measures could not compensate for lost infrastructure. Skilled laborers were conscripted into service, yet shortages of raw materials, steel, aluminum, fuel, meant output declined steadily. The home front became a war of attrition, not just against bombs, but against the very limits of production and supply. The psychological impact was profound. Civilians endured nights of terror, while workers faced impossible demands under fire. Military planners recognized the unavoidable truth. Even the most disciplined defense could not withstand sustained, industrial scale bombardment. Each destroyed factory, each flattened neighborhood, further eroded the Japanese capacity to wage war. Courage and ingenuity mattered less than sheer material capability. By summer 1945, the combined effect of strategic bombing, naval blockade, and the island hopping campaign had rendered Japan vulnerable to invasion. Cities lay in ruins, industrial output had collapsed, and morale had reached a breaking point. The arithmetic of industrial warfare had reached its final phase. The nation's capacity to produce weapons, feed soldiers, and sustain resistance was exhausted. The war was now poised to reach its climactic and most devastating conclusion. In the aftermath of surrender, the human dimension of the conflict became painfully clear. On the Japanese side, survivors of sunken ships, bombed cities, and shattered factories returned to homes that were often gone or uninhabitable. Many of the soldiers who had fought valiantly aboard vessels like the Yamato carried the memory of scarcity as vividly as they did the roar of battle. Each empty shell, each failed anti aircraft gun, each delayed shipment was etched into memory as a measure of helplessness, a knowledge that valor alone could not compensate for the limitations of production. In contrast, American servicemen often marveled at the abundance that sustained their campaigns. Pilots launched strike after strike, knowing more planes and bombs awaited them. Infantrymen in the Pacific Islands had access to ample rations, medical supplies, and replacement weapons. The logistics of war, often invisible to those on the front lines, became the silent hand that dictated survival and effectiveness. Each bullet fired was backed by a factory that could replace it hundreds of times over. Each bomb dropped represented the work of thousands of laborers, engineers, and logisticians whose efforts ensured the front lines never ran dry. The workers behind the weapons were no less crucial. In cities like Osaka and Tokyo, young men and women toiled in arsenals under harsh conditions, crafting what little could be made from dwindling raw materials. They scavenged copper, melted down bronze, and repurposed iron, producing shells that were sometimes faulty, sometimes insufficient. Every successful round was a small victory, every failure a reminder of the impossibility of matching an opponent with near limitless resources. Their courage was quiet, uncelebrated, yet profound. Each person laboring against the tide of scarcity to arm a nation on the brink of collapse. Across the ocean, American workers operated on a scale unimaginable to the Japanese laborers. In factories in Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and California, thousands of employees moved in concert with precise efficiency. Conveyor belts, assembly lines, and testing chambers transformed raw metal into hundreds of shells per hour. Quality control ensured reliability, and every part fit into a meticulously designed supply chain. Their contributions, though far from the battlefield, directly shaped the outcomes of battles they would never see, underscoring that in modern warfare, victory was produced long before the first shot was fired. Meanwhile, the disparity extended to morale and mental strain. Japanese soldiers often carried the knowledge that they were fighting against an industrial tide they could not match. Fatigue, hunger, and anxiety weighed on them as much as enemy fire. American forces, conversely, benefited from confidence born of abundance, knowing that supplies were virtually inexhaustible, allowed for bolder tactics, repeated assaults, and rapid replacement of losses. Psychological resilience, as much as material resources, became a weapon in itself. Even after the surrender, stories of ingenuity and perseverance emerged from both sides. Japanese workers continued to craft and repair what they could, driven by duty and hope. American engineers and logisticians documented innovations that would fuel post war industrial growth. Both experiences illuminated the human cost and contribution behind every round, every bomb, every fuse. War was no longer merely about strategy or bravery, it was about who could sustain the most, who could supply the most, and ultimately, whose people endured longest under unrelenting pressure. In the end, The arithmetic of ammunition had consequences that transcended the battlefield. It dictated the rhythm of combat, the choices of commanders, the endurance of civilians, and the survival of entire cities. Behind every statistic, there was a human face, a soldier clutching an empty magazine, a worker melting down a temple bell to forge one last shell, a pilot preparing to drop ordnance with confidence born of supply, a factory laborer ensuring the next shipment would arrive. The guns fell silent, but the shadow of industrial imbalance lingered long after the formal surrender. In the Pacific Islands, scorched cities and shattered landscapes bore witness to the consequences of a war dictated not just by strategy, but by the ability to produce, supply, and sustain. Soldiers returned home, civilians attempted to rebuild, and nations confronted the stark realization that victory and defeat were often measured in factories and shipping manifests as much as on battlefields. Japan faced a stark reckoning. Entire industries had been decimated by bombing campaigns designed to crush production capacity. Factories that once hummed with activity now lay in ruins, their machinery twisted, their skilled labor dispersed or lost. The scarcity that had plagued soldiers on the front lines now extended to every household. Families rationed rice and fuel, and a generation grew up acutely aware of the fragility of material abundance. Lessons learned under duress, how to salvage, improvise, and endure, would shape Japan's post war recovery and its approach to industry for decades to come. In contrast, the United States emerged with its industrial might largely intact, its infrastructure expanded and optimized through the war effort. The same assembly lines that produced bombs and shells could pivot to consumer goods almost immediately, fueling economic growth and the rise of a global superpower. Workers who had produced ordnance were now producing cars, refrigerators, and airplanes for the civilian market. The war had taught that scale, efficiency, and logistical mastery were not merely tools of military success. They were engines of national prosperity. The psychological impact of the ammunition disparity also left deep marks. Veterans from both sides carried memories of hunger, exhaustion, and the constant awareness of supply, or the lack thereof. For Japanese soldiers and civilians alike, the realization that courage and skill could be nullified by insufficient shells or fuel was a bitter lesson. For American troops, confidence born of abundance reinforced a belief in the supremacy of industrial power, a belief that would inform military and political strategies during the early Cold War. The broader world took notice. Analysts and strategists studied the war not only in terms of battles won and lost, but in terms of production capacity, raw material reserves, and transportation networks. The atomic age, emerging just as World War II concluded, magnified these lessons. Nations recognized that future conflicts would demand not just brave soldiers, but resilient industries, secure supply chains, and technological innovation capable of producing overwhelming force. The arithmetic of ammunition became a paradigm for understanding modern warfare. Amid this, individual stories continued to surface, humanizing the vast statistics. A Japanese factory worker recalled melting down temple bells to forge one last artillery shell, while an American assembly line operator remembered the pride of seeing her work contribute directly to missions halfway across the globe. These personal narratives underscored a fundamental truth. War is waged not only with weapons and strategy, but with human ingenuity, endurance, and the unseen labor that transforms raw materials into instruments of survival. By the late 1940s, as Reconstruction took root, these lessons informed policies, industrial planning, and military doctrine. Supply chains were no longer an afterthought. They were central to national security. Stockpiles, production capabilities, and logistical planning became as critical as combat readiness. The echoes of the ammunition disparity reverberated, shaping not only how nations prepared for war, but how they understood the intricate link between human effort, industry, and the fates of millions. As nations rebuilt, the scars of World War II remained etched in both landscapes and minds. Cities rose from rubble, factories were repaired or newly constructed, and millions sought to reclaim normalcy. Yet beneath this surface of reconstruction, a new tension simmered, the ideological and industrial rivalry that would come to define the Cold War. The lessons of the ammunition disparity were clear. Nations had witnessed firsthand how the lack of industrial capacity could decide battles and how the ability to produce, transport, and sustain resources determined survival. In the United States, policymakers and military planners worked tirelessly to ensure that this lesson was never forgotten. Stockpiles of conventional arms were maintained at unprecedented levels, and research into advanced technologies, from jet aircraft to nuclear weapons, received enormous investment. The mantra was simple: superior production equals superior security. Across the globe, the Soviet Union pursued a parallel path. The destruction of German industry during the war had provided both a warning and an opportunity. Soviet planners poured resources into heavy industry, prioritizing the production of tanks, artillery, and later, nuclear devices. The experience of wartime scarcity shaped a doctrine of relentless industrial mobilization, ensuring that their armed forces would never again be constrained by material shortages in conflict. The former Axis powers, particularly Japan and Germany, also absorbed the lesson. Though initially constrained by occupation and reparations, both nations would eventually channel their wartime experiences into remarkable economic recoveries. Japan's post-war miracle, driven by efficiency, innovation, and relentless productivity, was rooted in the same understanding that wartime scarcity had taught. The strength of a nation lies not only in its people or its weapons, but in its ability to produce consistently, at scale, and under pressure. Meanwhile, ordinary people, whose labor had once forged shells and bullets, now found themselves at the center of a new industrial revolution. Factories pivoted from destruction to creation, building cars, appliances, and electronics. Yet the shadow of military necessity remained. Civilian industries were expected to convert rapidly in the event of conflict, a principle that became central to Cold War defense planning. Every assembly line, every production quota was subtly infused with the memory of war's unforgiving arithmetic. The emerging geopolitical landscape reflected this new reality. Alliances were formed not only on ideological grounds, but with a careful eye on industrial capabilities. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the Warsaw Pact were as much economic and production partnerships as military coalitions. Strategic planning extended far beyond battlefield maneuvers. It encompassed resource allocation, supply chain resilience, and technological superiority. In this environment, The echoes of World War II's ammunition disparity shaped more than just military doctrine. They influenced diplomacy, economics, and international relations. Nations measured not only each other's armies, but also their industrial heartbeats. Every barrel of steel, every ton of fuel, every functioning factory became a symbol of power, a tangible guarantee that a nation could endure, adapt, and prevail if conflict erupted again. The arithmetic of ammunition had transformed into a broader calculus, the equation of modern power. Quantity, quality, and logistics were inseparable from strategy, and no government could afford to ignore the lessons of the past. War had been a brutal teacher, but its lessons would define the Cold War and beyond, shaping a world where industrial might became the backbone of security, influence, and survival. Amid the hum of factories and the roar of assembly lines, ordinary people became the hidden architects of a global struggle. Engineers, laborers, scientists, and technicians, many of them shaped by the hardships of World War II, found themselves in a new kind of battlefield, one of production, innovation, and endurance. In American cities, men and women who had once labored in wartime factories adapted their skills to peacetime, yet remained on constant alert. The assembly lines that produced rifles and tanks pivoted to automobiles, airplanes, and consumer electronics. But they were always designed for quick reconversion in the event of conflict. Military contractors collaborated closely with inventors, merging civilian and defense technology. The transition from wartime to peacetime was seamless, yet tense. The lessons of scarcity and urgency lingered like an ever present shadow. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet citizens experienced a similar reality. Labor was regimented, quotas were strict, and innovation was celebrated if it advanced the state's industrial or military capacity. Engineers worked long hours in sprawling plants, developing everything from advanced artillery to the emerging field of rocket technology. For them, success was survival, both personal and national. Failure could mean not only career setbacks, but in some cases, political consequences. Yet within these constraints, creativity thrived. The space race, nuclear research, and industrial innovations all sprang from the same wartime lessons of efficiency, scale, and speed. The Cold War also saw the rise of technological pioneers, whose work blurred the line between science and strategy. Mathematicians, chemists, and physicists, many of them veterans or refugees from wartime Europe, became indispensable. Their calculations ensured that missiles could reach targets with precision, nuclear plants could function safely, and supply chains could endure under pressure. Each innovation was a silent but powerful tool in the ongoing geopolitical chess game. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens became the lifeblood of industrial might. Factory workers, technicians, and logistics coordinators were not just filling quotas, they were embodying national resilience. Their labor connected distant resources to frontline readiness, transforming raw materials into tangible instruments of security and influence. In cafeterias, dormitories, and workshops, stories of perseverance, ingenuity, and quiet heroism circulated, reminding everyone that wars might be fought on battlefields, but their outcomes were shaped in factories and laboratories. This era also witnessed the increasing interdependence of technology, industry, and strategy. Innovations in computing, metallurgy, and transportation accelerated production capabilities and introduced new forms of efficiency. Military planners incorporated these advancements into their doctrines, understanding that speed and precision in production could rival even the most skilled battlefield maneuvers. The lessons of ammunition shortage had evolved into a comprehensive philosophy: control production, master logistics, and ensure readiness at all times. By the late 1950s, the world had entered a paradoxical state of tense stability. Nations stockpiled weapons, developed technologies at breakneck speed, and trained citizens in industrial vigilance, all in the name of peace. The Cold War had transformed the human experience of industry. Ordinary people were no longer just workers, they were active participants in the strategic calculus of global security. Their hands shaped not only metal and machinery, but the balance of power itself. The echoes of World War II's supply crises had become permanent reminders. A nation, SE strength, was inseparable from its capacity to produce, innovate, and sustain. And as the decades progressed, these lessons would continue to define both conflicts and alliances, bridging the gap between human effort and national destiny. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Cold War had shifted into a high stakes competition of technology and innovation. The lessons learned from World War II's industrial challenges now fueled a new arena: missiles, nuclear weapons, and space exploration. Nations understood that supremacy was no longer just about armies on the ground. It was about who could control the skies, orbiting satellites, and the invisible currents of information and energy. In the United States, the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, demanded unprecedented collaboration between scientists, military strategists, and industrial engineers. Factories churned out advanced guidance systems, rocket components, and nuclear warheads, while research laboratories pushed the boundaries of physics and material science. Each breakthrough carried the weight of potential deterrence. A single miscalculation could spark catastrophe. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union matched these efforts with relentless determination. Rocketry pioneers like Sergei Korolev led programs that would soon place the first satellite, Sputnik, into orbit. The achievement sent shockwaves around the globe, igniting fears and admiration alike. Beyond the technological feat, it was a statement of national pride, signaling that the USSR could compete on the world stage, not only militarily, but scientifically. Space became the ultimate proving ground. Satellites weren't merely instruments of exploration, they were tools of surveillance, communication, and propaganda. Both superpowers sought dominance in orbit, understanding that control of space could tip the balance of power on Earth. Engineers, mathematicians, and programmers worked tirelessly to perfect launch sequences, orbital mechanics, and communication protocols. Ordinary citizens, students, factory workers, and bureaucrats became part of this vast ecosystem, contributing in ways often invisible yet essential. The nuclear dimension intensified the stakes. ICBMs armed with thermonuclear warheads transformed deterrence strategies. Cities and military installations became potential targets, and the concept of mutually assured destruction emerged as both a strategy and a psychological reality. Engineers and technicians refined delivery systems, while strategists calculated trajectories, timing, and fail-safes. Meanwhile, civil defense programs tried to prepare ordinary people for scenarios that could scarcely be imagined. Amid this high-tech race, innovation wasn't confined to military applications. Satellite imagery spurred advances in meteorology, telecommunications, and even agriculture. The pressure to innovate rapidly created a culture of experimentation, urgency, and sometimes reckless brilliance. Mistakes could be expensive, financially, politically, or even in human lives, but stagnation was unacceptable. Every success reinforced the belief that technological mastery could secure not only national survival, but also global influence. By the mid 1960s, the Cold War's technological landscape had become a theater of its own. Laboratories and launch pads replaced battlefields, while factories and research centers became the new fortresses. The lessons of World War II's production crises were never forgotten. A nation unprepared in materials, manpower, or innovation risked irrelevance. The Cold War had transformed industry and science into instruments of strategy, linking the fates of nations to the ingenuity and resilience of their people. While missiles soared and satellites circled the globe, another war unfolded in shadows. One fought not with armies, but with information. Espionage became a critical instrument of Cold War strategy, shaping decisions that could alter the fate of nations without a single shot being fired. Both superpowers understood that knowledge was as valuable as nuclear arsenals. Intelligence agencies, from the CIA in the United States to the KGB in the Soviet Union, expanded rapidly, employing networks of spies, informants, and double agents. Each secret uncovered, each plan intercepted, could provide a decisive advantage or prevent disaster. Operatives worked in cities around the world, blending seamlessly into daily life while transmitting secrets in invisible ink, coded radio signals, or elaborate dead drops. Technological breakthroughs fueled espionage as well. Hidden microphones, miniature cameras, and early computer systems allowed intelligence services to collect, analyze, and transmit data at speeds previously unimaginable. The race for technological superiority was mirrored in the intelligence arena. Cryptographers decrypted codes, while counterintelligence units hunted moles with almost obsessive precision. Mistakes were lethal. Lives, careers, and national security hung on the fragile threads of secrecy. Not all operations were purely strategic. Covert actions ranged from political sabotage and propaganda campaigns to the manipulation of elections and infiltration of enemy organizations. Proxy wars in far-flung regions became laboratories for espionage tactics. Agents influenced governments, steered public opinion, and sometimes orchestrated coups, all under the ever-present risk of exposure. When spies were caught, the consequences reverberated globally, threatening diplomatic crises and occasionally nuclear escalation. Yet espionage was also personal, human, and often tragic. Agents lived double lives, burdened with secrecy and isolation. Friendships were measured by trust that could never be fully given, and mistakes could cost not only missions but lives. Some became legends, celebrated in later decades for their cunning and bravery. Others were forgotten, shadows themselves, lost in the complex web of deception and counter-deception. Through it all, the intelligence struggle shaped the Cold War as profoundly as any battlefield. Strategic decisions about missile deployments, space exploration, and military readiness were guided not only by technology, but by what could be learned and what could be hidden. In the unseen corridors of power, battles were waged with whispers, coded messages, and careful calculation. The world watched the surface, but the true contest of influence occurred in secrecy, where every piece of information had the potential to tip the scales. Beyond the missiles and espionage, the Cold War seeped into the daily lives of millions, shaping culture, behavior, and even the collective psyche. Fear became a constant companion. The threat of nuclear annihilation was abstract yet omnipresent, lurking in school drills, government pamphlets, and the political rhetoric that dominated airwaves. Children practiced duck and cover, citizens stocked fallout shelters, and entire communities internalized the possibility that the world could end in an instant. Propaganda campaigns infiltrated every medium: posters, films, radio broadcasts, and literature reinforced the ideological divide. In the United States, anti communist sentiment permeated politics and culture, encouraging vigilance against perceived subversive elements. McCarthyism fueled paranoia, careers were destroyed, and neighbors turned suspicious of one another. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union and its satellite states, state controlled media celebrated socialism's triumphs while demonizing capitalist decadence, shaping public perception through controlled narratives. Yet fear and propaganda were only part of the story. The Cold War also catalyzed innovation and cultural shifts. Space programs, driven by competition between the superpowers, inspired scientific curiosity and a sense of wonder. The race to the moon, advances in computing, and the exploration of new technologies were fueled by the same pressures that produced espionage networks and military strategies. Art, music, and literature responded as well, reflecting anxiety, hope, and the tension of living under an unseen but ever present threat. At the individual level, psychological pressures were immense. People measured their words, their associations, and even their thoughts against a backdrop of potential surveillance. The constant awareness of ideological stakes created a unique form of societal stress, one that historians and psychologists would later identify as shaping an entire generation's worldview. Yet resilience emerged too. Communities adapted, humor flourished in the face of fear, and human ingenuity found outlets even within the constraints of suspicion and censorship. The Cold War's cultural imprint extended globally. Proxy conflicts, political alliances, and ideological propaganda influenced nations far from Washington and Moscow. Education, entertainment, and media were all battlegrounds of influence. The competition was as much for hearts and minds as for strategic territory. Citizens became participants in a global theater, their daily lives shaped by forces often beyond comprehension. Ultimately, the Cold War was not solely a contest of weapons or ideology. It was a war for perception, a struggle to shape reality itself. Its echoes persisted long after treaties were signed and walls fell. The lessons of fear, resilience, and the power of narrative would continue to inform global politics, technology, and culture for decades to come. By the 1980s, the prolonged strain of the Cold War began to show cracks in both superpowers. The Soviet Union faced mounting economic stagnation, political corruption, and an overextended military burden. The war in Afghanistan had drained resources, morale, and international credibility, while internal dissent simmered among satellite states. Citizens demanded reform, pushing leaders to confront a reality their ideological frameworks had long ignored. Meanwhile, the United States, though economically resilient, recognized that continued escalation was unsustainable. Diplomatic channels opened, treaties were negotiated, and arms reduction became a focal point of international policy. Leaders such as Mikhail Gorbachev introduced sweeping reforms, glasnost, and perestroika, aiming to rejuvenate the Soviet system. Yet these measures inadvertently accelerated its unraveling. Openness revealed decades of inefficiency, while economic restructuring highlighted the impossibility of competing indefinitely in the nuclear and conventional arms race. The symbolic and literal fall of barriers followed. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, a defining emblem of Cold War division, was breached by citizens demanding freedom and unity. Across Eastern Europe, governments fell, often peacefully, under waves of popular protest. The ideological battleground that had defined global politics for nearly half a century began to dissolve, replaced by uncertainty, hope, and a sudden, liberating chaos. By 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved, leaving 15 independent republics and marking the definitive end of the Cold War era. The world faced a new geopolitical reality, unbalanced by the rigid bipolarity that had constrained international action for decades. Former allies and adversaries alike navigated a terrain reshaped by the lessons of decades long tension, the fragility of economies under military strain, the power of information and perception, and the profound human costs of ideological rigidity. Yet the legacy of the Cold War endured beyond borders, governments, and technologies. The arms race had driven innovations in computing, aerospace, and telecommunications. Cultural exchanges and propaganda campaigns left indelible marks on art, literature, cinema, and public consciousness. Even decades later, strategies, fears, and tactics from that era continue to influence military planning, diplomacy, and global security considerations. The human dimension remained compelling. Generations who grew up under the shadow of mutual assured destruction carried memories, fears, and stories that transcended textbooks. Families preserved accounts of drills, of whispered conversations, of moments when the possibility of annihilation felt tangible. Scholars, policymakers, and citizens alike grappled with understanding how societies had functioned under such persistent uncertainty and how close the world had been to calamity. Ultimately, the Cold War was more than an ideological conflict. It was a profound test of human resilience, adaptability, and the capacity to imagine both apocalypse and possibility. The lessons it left behind, the consequences of unchecked escalation, the limits of industrial and military might, the critical role of diplomacy and perception remain enduring truths for any civilization seeking to navigate the delicate balance between power and survival. The Cold War, spanning nearly half a century, reshaped the world in profound and lasting ways. Beyond the political tension, the nuclear standoffs, and the ideological battles, it was a story of human ingenuity, endurance, and the pursuit of security under extraordinary circumstances. One of the most enduring lessons is the duality of power. Both the United States and the Soviet Union wielded immense technological and military capabilities, yet their rivalry also underscored the limitations of force. True influence proved as dependent on diplomacy, perception, and cultural appeal as on armies or missiles. The Cold War illustrated that survival often depends not just on strength, but on restraint, negotiation, and an understanding of global interconnectedness. Culturally, the era left an indelible imprint. Art, literature, and cinema reflected the anxieties, hopes, and contradictions of a world under the shadow of nuclear threat. Music, films, and novels became vessels for the fears of ordinary people, the strategies of governments, and the moral questions raised by an era in which the potential for total destruction loomed ever present. Economically and technologically, the Cold War catalyzed unprecedented innovation, from space exploration to computing, from medical research to energy development. The competition drove progress that shaped modern life, yet it also revealed the cost of misallocation, secrecy, and ideological rigidity, lessons that remain relevant to policymakers and scientists today. Finally, the human story at the heart of the Cold War cannot be overstated. Millions lived with anxiety, curiosity, and hope. Families and individuals navigated a world divided by walls, both physical and ideological, seeking meaning, security, and opportunity. The resilience, creativity, and courage displayed by ordinary people amidst extraordinary tension remain a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Today, as the world faces new challenges, geopolitical shifts, technological revolutions, and global crises, the Cold War offers both warning and guidance. It reminds us that the pursuit of power without understanding or fear without perspective can bring the world to the brink. Yet it also demonstrates that dialogue, empathy, and strategic foresight can avert catastrophe and lay the groundwork for peace, cooperation, and shared progress. In the end, the Cold War was not just a chapter of history, it was a mirror reflecting humanity's capacity for both conflict and collaboration, destruction and creation. Its echoes continue to shape the 21st century, urging future generations to learn, remember, and navigate the delicate balance between ambition and responsibility.